Take your Bibles, please. Open to the book of Matthew. We decided we'd spend a year or two just looking at different aspects of Jesus and his teaching. And a few weeks we'll pick up with the Sermon on the Mount. But during this month we're looking at what's oftentimes called Jesus' Olivet Discourse, in which he was talking about the signs of the end of time and the signs of his coming. We call this little series Fast Forward. And I want to review just a little bit because we're going to jump right in. If you were not able to be here last week, just so you'll be caught up with us, how many of you were here last week? All right, good. That's good. We're going to kind of pick up, but allow us just a moment or two to review, because the Olivet Discourse takes place 3 or 4 days before the crucifixion. It's Tuesday, and he's been fighting with the Pharisees in the temple. He'll be crucified on Friday. And you recall last week that he gives that whole series of woes to the Pharisees in Matthew 23 because of all their religious arrogance and legalism. And he blasts them really hard. And then he says, I tell you the truth, not one stone of this temple is going to be left on another stone. It's going to become desolate. And we saw last week how that was accomplished by the Romans and why no stones were left, exactly fulfilled as he predicted. And the disciples are stunned because they can't imagine if the temple's gone, well, it must be the end of time. And so look with me there in Matthew 24, verse 3. They left the temple. They went through the Kidron Valley. It's about a half an hour, 45-minute walk. And they're stunned. They don't say a word till they get up on the Mount of Olives. And they came to him very quietly, and they asked him 3 questions. Tell us, when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the sign at the end of the age? They ask him 3 questions. Number 1, when will this happen? What? The destruction of the temple, all the stones knocked down. And you recall the chiasm last week. He answered that by saying, when will this happen? Jesus said, this generation will not pass away until you see these things. And so it was a few years later in 70 A.D., the generation those disciples were living in witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem. 2 other questions. What's the sign of your coming? And what's the sign of the end of the age? Now, the disciples lumped all of these together. They couldn't imagine in any form or fashion. They couldn't imagine that when the temple was gone, it just couldn't be the end of everything. But they're not simultaneous. Remember we saw last week a couple of principles. Still reviewing just for a moment. The mountain peak principle, which is what? Events that seem close together may be separated by various lengths of time. You'll find this often in prophecy. It's like you're looking over here at a mountain, and it's like 3 mountains are right together. But you know how it is when you get close to the first mountain range, you discover they're not really close together. There can be a mountain here, and a mountain here, another mountain over here. And they're separated by different lengths of time. The first mountain peak here, 70 A.D., temple was destroyed. Next time, what are the signs of the second coming? Now, the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., but the second coming hasn't occurred, so there's some time in here. And there's also some time between the second coming and the end of the age. And that's important to keep in mind because when you go through this passage in Matthew, Jesus' commentary, Jesus' teaching, he seems to jump all over the place. And it takes a little sorting out. So understanding that things aren't necessarily simultaneous are very healthy things. Remember last week, Jesus was teaching us, or we talked about what's called oftentimes the multiple fulfillment principle. And that is that a lot of prophecies have more than one fulfillment. We talked last week, just reviewing for a second, Isaiah chapter 14, verse 7. That's kind of a Christmas verse, but it had a context. The Assyrians were about to destroy Jerusalem. The king was afraid. God gave him a sign. Here was the sign. Isaiah said, see that little virgin over there? Before that virgin can get married and have a baby, and that baby grew up to know the difference between right and wrong, before that happens, 10 or 12, 15 years maybe, the Assyrians will no longer be a threat. Stop worrying about them. And that happened. But it had another fulfillment. Remember in Matthew chapter 2 or so? Remember Matthew said, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child, and you'll call his name what? Emmanuel, God with us. Here comes Jesus. And so a lot of things are fulfilled multiple times. We saw last week the signs leading up to verse 14. And Jesus said you'll see wars and rumors of war and all these things, but it's not the end. That's not the sign. But he said, when you see the abomination of desolation, verse 15, Matthew 24, standing in the holy place, the one spoken of by Daniel the prophet, dash, let the reader understand. Now, who did the dash? Matthew. And what Matthew's saying is, you can understand these things. You can read some of the signs at the very end. You don't have to be confused, nor do you have to be baffled. You can understand these things. And you recall very simply that multiple fulfillment, many times happening, that the abomination of desolation was really fulfilled 168 B.C. You recall that Daniel was writing about 560 B.C. And about 400 years later, Antiochus Epiphanes came, and he went into the holy place of the temple and slaughtered a pig and turned the treasuries into brothels, and he desecrated the temple, and he began to destroy Jews by the hundreds of thousands. He was going to wipe out the Jews. Not the first time that's happened. And then in 70 A.D., the one that Jesus specifically referred to in their generation, well, Titus and the Romans came, destroyed the city. Jesus said, get out of town. And they predict as many as 3 million Jews were being wiped out by the Romans, who also were anti-Semitics, wanted to kill all the Jews. But there's also a future fulfillment. We haven't seen that one yet. But Jesus said, here's your sign. This is for us. When you see that abomination of desolation, you know the end is near. And Revelation and others talk about the future fulfillment of that abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Jesus gave it to us as a sign. And here's the interesting thing. Matthew says, you can understand these things. The book of Revelation, when Jesus is speaking, he says, you can understand these things. These are not to be dark. They're not to be unravelable. You can figure these things out. Read the scriptures. You'll know these things. So what I'd like to do this morning is talk about what does it mean in verse 15, let the reader understand. And what we're going to do is kind of lay the framework, because in the book of Daniel, we're going to go back to Daniel, where Jesus referred us. And he says, if you understand Daniel, you've got the whole framework to answer all of these questions. And it's kind of like Daniel's a skeleton, okay? And it's the framework. And all the other prophecies, from Ezekiel to some other ones in Daniel, to Revelation, to 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, to Matthew 24, they're all like the meat, so to speak, the flesh on the skeleton. You know, if you don't have a skeleton, your body's just a blob. You know, it's just all it would be. You got to have a skeleton to keep it erect. You put things on your skeleton. And Daniel is the skeleton. So Jesus says, when you see this, here's your sign. And Matthew says, go back to Daniel so you can understand these things. So let's go back to Daniel. There are two passages in Daniel which give the framework. The first one is identified as what you and I might call a multimetallic man, Daniel 2. The other one is over in Daniel chapter 9, where he talks about what's called the 70 sevens prophecy. So take your Bible and go to Daniel chapter 2. We'll start there first. There was a king named Nebuchadnezzar, and he had a dream one night that scared the pants off of him. He was terrified when he awakened. It was this giant colossus, and some things happened to it. And he was frightened, so he called all the wise men in and said, who can tell me the dream and what it means? And they said, well, Lord King, tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation. He said, no, I don't trust you guys. Tell me the dream and the interpretation, I'm going to kill all of you. And Daniel was a wise man. He heard of this, so Daniel said, hold it. Tell the king I can tell him the dream. I can give him the interpretation. And that night, Daniel dreamed the same dream, and God gave him the interpretation. And so he stands up there in Daniel chapter 2, and he begins to describe for us the dream Nebuchadnezzar saw. It's a picture of the world kingdoms from Babylon till the second coming of Christ. There was his head. I'm going to draw this not quite an exact scale, but it's pretty close. All right? Okay. He said, you saw this head, and the head was made out of gold. And this giant colossus had a head of gold. It had arms and a chest of silver. It had a belly and thighs of bronze. It had legs of iron. It had feet down here and 10 toes of iron plus clay. And Nebuchadnezzar said, that's exactly what I dreamed, but the dream's not over. He said, you saw, O king, that this stone cut without human hands came out of the sky, it crashed the image on its feet and toes, and it ground the whole thing to powder. And a big wind came up and blew all the powder away, and this stone grew up to be a mountain which fills the whole earth. That's exactly what I dreamed. And Daniel said, well, okay, now, I gave you the dream. You can trust the interpretation. The God of heaven gives it to me. The interpretation is certain. Now, what's the interpretation? Well, let's look to the head of gold, shall we? Daniel chapter 2, verse 37, 38. Here's the interpretation. You, O king, are the king of kings. You've got dominion over the whole world because God gave it to you. And look at the bottom there in verse 38. You are the head of gold. So we know that kingdom. There's the next kingdom, the silver kingdom, breast and arms. We know that the kingdom to arise after Babylon was the Medes and the Persians. After you, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. How do we know it's the Medes and the Persians? Well, it's in history. It's in Daniel as well. He records the history. In Daniel chapter 5, King Belteshazzar was having a big party. And he's not watching. Because while the party's going on, the Medes and the Persians are damming up the Euphrates. And then now they're slipping in under the dry riverbed up under the wall to destroy Jerusalem. And while the party's going on, this hand appears. And it begins writing on the plaster of the wall. And it writes the words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Which means number, number, weight, division. And God gave the interpretation. Number, your number's up. It's time. Weight. Your kingdom's been weighed in the balances. It's been found wanting. Division. It's divided tonight and given to the Medes and the Persians. That followed exactly as Daniel predicted. There's another kingdom. The belly and thighs of brass. And we know that's Greece because over in Daniel chapter 8, God tells us, third kingdom is Greece. It was the one to arise after the Medes and the Persians. You remember that the Macedonians, Greeks, are the ones who destroyed the Persians at several critical battles. Next, the third kingdom out of bronze will rule over the whole earth. Who ruled the whole earth in those days? Alexander the Great. And it's interesting, when Alexander the Great besieged Jerusalem to conquer it, there was a priest named Jaddu who ran out the front door. And he had the scroll of Daniel. And he said, well, let me talk to Alexander. And history tells us that he opened up Daniel the prophet and he showed Alexander where he was mentioned in this image. And then he showed Alexander in chapter 8 where the king of Greece is identified. And Alexander the Great was so impressed, he left a garrison in Jerusalem to guard and protect it while he raced down to Egypt to continue his conquests. So Alexander read this. We've got two legs of iron, shall we? Verse 40. Finally, there'll be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. For iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it'll crush and break all the others. The great world nation to follow Greece was Rome. Every school child knows about the iron legions of Rome. Two legs. Well, that was predicted. Remember when the Roman Empire began to decay, it was divided into two parts. Eastern and Western Empire. In fact, religiously, the Roman Catholic Church grew out of the Western leg, and the Greek Orthodox Church grew out of the Eastern leg. And we have those two religious divisions because the political division of this giant kingdom. But he's not through. There are feet of iron and clay. Now, a couple of thoughts. The feet and iron of clay is the nation in existence when Christ returns. So if we know who those folks are, we're going to have a good indication the coming of Christ is here. Now, there's no other great world empire from God's perspective until this little mixed kingdom is ruling the area of the old Roman Empire. How many toes? 10. Well, let's read about this feet of iron and clay. Just as you saw, the toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron. This is going to be a divided kingdom. Now, they're going to come together, but they don't stick very well. 10 countries. It'll have some of the strength of iron in it, but even as you saw iron mixed with clay, it's not going to have quite as much strength. As toes are partly iron and partly clay, the kingdom will be partly strong, partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with clay, so the people will be a mixture and not remain united any more than iron mixed with clay. It's going to be a mixture of all kinds of peoples, and apparently 10 nations, 10 because Daniel describes earlier in his book the 10 kings, the 10 kingdoms, how one of the kings destroys 3 others, and how that king becomes the Antichrist, and they're describing the area of the old Roman Empire. The old Roman Empire is still in existence, to some degree. It's never been forgotten. The lands are still there. Charlemagne tried to resurrect it in about 400 AD with the Franks. He couldn't pull it off. The great Emperor Napoleon had the dedicated goal of reuniting the areas of the Roman Empire. He didn't pull it off. The Habsburgs of Austria decided they'd war and pull it off. They couldn't pull it off. The Kaisers of Germany, Kaiser, Caesar, and they couldn't pull it off. And Adolf Hitler said, we'll have the Third Reich. And he didn't pull it off either. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. You know what's written about? This passage. Yeah, Humpty Dumpty was the dream image. And he falls off the wall. And all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again. But the Antichrist is going to try. And this is the framework now for the coming of this one called the Antichrist. There's a rock that grows up to fill the whole earth. What's the rock? We know exactly what the rock is. The interpretation, verse 44. In the time of those kings, which ones? The 10 toes. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom never to be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. Here's the coming of Christ. It'll crush those kingdoms. Remember the image gets hit, turns into powder? And bring them to an end, but it itself will endure it forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. What does that mean? You know, man can make a brick, but only God can make a stone. This is a God thing, not a man thing. A rock that breaks the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, all the pieces. And we know who the rock is. Jesus talked about this. Matthew 21, Jesus said, haven't you read the scriptures? See, he wants us to know the answers to these things. If you read the scriptures, this is not hard to discern some of these things. Haven't you read the scriptures? He's referring back to Daniel. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That's prophesied in Isaiah. And he says earlier, I'm the cornerstone, see? Paul talks about Christ being the cornerstone. And then Jesus says, here's the Daniel passage. He who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but he upon whom it falls will be crushed. Jesus said, I'm the stone. I'm going to set up my kingdom. How about a couple of lessons from this? And we'll see this played out and being played out in our day and in human history. A couple of lessons we learned from this Colossus. Number one, all governments stand on delicate foundations. Think of this. You got this heavy head. You got this heavier arms and chest. You got even heavier bronze thighs. You've got even heavier iron. And this whole Colossus is held up by what? Feet of iron and clay. All human governments stand on delicate foundations. That's why every time you and I turn around, another nation's government is fallen. There's civil wars all over our country. Governments don't last forever. They all eventually dissipate, decay, and no longer exist. The average length of any civilization, max, runs around 200 years. We've already had what, 235 years? We're past the average by a long shot. Number two, the lesson. All human governments eventually deteriorate and decay. All of them. See, you're the head of gold. And another one inferior to you. Governments tend to cycle down for all kinds of biblical reasons. And what starts out with gold and silver moves to brass and iron. And what starts out as a head of gold ends up in the mud. In fact, Alexander Tyler wrote during the American Revolution. He was a British guy. And he wrote during the American Revolution about the American attempts at democracy. Now, for what I want to say, I want you to know, I want to live in a democracy. Seen plenty of the other governments. I want to be in a democracy. But remember now, all human governments eventually decay. They all do. And he's writing about the Greeks, but he's referring to the American experiment in democracy. But he goes back through history at the democracies that have been there. And here's what he observes. I wrote this in your insert because some of you would write me and say, I want that quote. So you don't have to email me. I put it right here. He wrote, a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves money from the public treasury. From the moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most money from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policies and is always followed by a dictatorship. There's a vacuum of power and somebody sucks it up. Again, I think democracy is best. Hope the world can have it. But I just understand, no democracy lasts forever. And he's giving us why. The average age of the world's great civilization is around 200 years. These Masons have progressed in the following sequence. In some ways, he's predicting this about our country, but he's learning from the past. From bondage to spiritual faith, to great courage, to liberty, to abundance, to selfishness, to complacency, to apathy, to dependency, and back to bondage. You see the cycle? Think of our country, spiritual faith. Remember, a lot of our forefathers came over here because of religious persecution, had a pretty solid religious foundation, among other reasons. And then there was courage, the guts to do a revolution, which led to liberty and abundance. I mean, we still have the abundance of the world. Now watch, to selfishness, to complacency, to apathy. Think of the voter turnouts. This is one example. To dependency on who? The federal government. Take care of me now. And back to what? To bondage. All human governments eventually deteriorate and decay. Our nation will not last forever. That's why it's best to be plugged into God's program. See? No government lasts forever. But here's an interesting thing this teaches us. The power of human governments is increasing. See, you got gold, but nobody shoots a golden arrow. It's just too soft. Silver's a little better, but bronze, now we're talking arrowheads. And iron, see, we're going from weakness to strength. And our nation, the world's increasing in its power. You know, back in the Revolutionary War, the killing zone was about 50 yards. You could take your musket, and about 50 yards was the effective range. And you know, the book of Revelation talks about millions and millions being killed. You couldn't shoot your musket fast enough to do what Revelation, but now we can. And in an age when, look at the governments of our world are struggling for any kind of unity, we've got the power to blow the world up. Those are just some of the lessons we learned from Daniel. And those are important as you and I begin to put the framework together. So that's one passage. That's the Colossus, the end of the world, the picture of the kingdom. Now there's a second passage. It comes from Daniel chapter 9. If you'll take your Bibles and turn over there. It's called the 77s prophecy. Now, the word seven, I'm going to make this real simple. It could be really complex, but I'm going to make it real simple. The word seven in Hebrew is heptad. Now, for example, how many are in a dozen? 12. How many are in a heptad? 7. You can have 12 bananas, 12 oranges. A dozen bananas, a dozen oranges. We know how many bananas and oranges. You can have a heptad of oranges. How many is that? 7. You can have a heptad of bananas. 7. You can have a heptad of years, because the concept here is years. So 70 periods of 7 years each. That's what this means. 7 times 70 is what? 490 years. All right, let's look at this passage here in a little more detail. Verse 24, Daniel 9. 77s 490 years. See, what happened is, when Israel went into bondage, Jeremiah predicted in his book that God would take them into bondage for 70 years and then bring them back. And as Daniel writes, it's been 69 years. He's going, wow, 69 years. It's getting close. And in fact, a year later, the first group of Jews headed back to Israel. And here's what God said to Daniel. Okay, I got two plans for the nation of Israel. One of them lasts 70 years. It's about over. And now we're going to talk about the plan that lasts 790 years. 490 years are decreed for your people and your holy city. And here's a picture of the coming kingdom. Finish transgressions, put an end to sin, atone for wickedness, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision and prophecy. That means it all comes to a conclusion. To anoint the most holy. Verse 25. Now that's the overview. Now he's going to flesh in some details. Know and understand this. See this? I want you to know these things. Oh, I could never understand prophecy. Well, you gave up too early. I want you to know these things. I want you to understand these things. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes. What have we just said there? Okay, we know when it starts, when they issue the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. We know when that occurred. Until the coming of the Christ, there'll be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. How many is that? 69. 69 7 is 483. It'll be rebuilt, Jerusalem, with streets and a trench in times of trouble. Now we know when this started. I'm going to put a slide on the screen. Don't expect you to memorize this, but I put it in your inserts because some of you will find this interesting. Here's how there were Jews who were counting the days and the years. That's why in the New Testament times you find people in the temple waiting for the coming of Christ. They understood Daniel. The decree to go restore Jerusalem was made by King Xerxes, Persian, on March the 4th, 444 BC. That date's set. Okay, real simple. 7 plus 62 is 69 7. 69 times 7 is 483 years until Christ comes. But it is true that the prophetical years of the Jews were 360 days. There were Jewish guys figuring this out. Jesus said, you can understand this. 483 years times 360 days per year is 173,880 days. You say, well, who cares? Well, here's the point. 173,880 days after March 4, 444 BC, is Palm Sunday, April the 6th, 32 AD. You know, this is one of the clearest predictions of the coming of Christ and the reality of the anointed Son of God of all the Bible. Daniel predicted to the very day, Palm Sunday, when Christ would come in his triumph. Verse 26. Here's an interesting thing. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one, and now 3 things happen. Now, we got 7 sevens. Why 7 sevens? It took 49 years to rebuild the temple. You got 7 sevens, and you got 62 more. So 7 sevens plus 62 more is 483 years. Christ comes on Palm Sunday. 3 things happen. After the 69 sevens, the anointed one's cut off. Who's that? The Messiah, Jesus, cut off, crucified. After Palm Sunday, he's crucified, has nothing. He'll be resurrected later. Second thing, after the 483 years, 69 sevens, the people of the ruler who'll come will destroy the city. In Christ's time, that was the Romans and Titus. They destroyed the city. The one who is to come, here's a double fulfillment. We'll see this next week in Revelation. The Antichrist people will slaughter Jerusalem. And the one who's to come is the Antichrist. And the end will come like a flood, third thing. And wars and rumors of wars and desolations will continue until the end of the age. Time out. Time out. After 69 sevens on Palm Sunday, God called time out. There is 1/7 to go. It hasn't happened yet. That last 7's pretty significant. um, Mountain Peak Principle? You ever watch the NBA basketball game and somebody calls timeout with 30 seconds left in the game? And how many more minutes does it take to finish the game? 25 or 30? Timeout. Palm Sunday, God said, timeout. The prophetic clock stopped at 483 years. And we are living now in the space between Palm Sunday and the days of the second coming, around the last 7. We'll talk about how many that might be next week. Verse 27. And he, this Antichrist, will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. This is God's plan for Israel. So there's a peace treaty between this Antichrist and Israel for how many years? 7. In the middle of the 7, this Antichrist, Daniel talks about in a couple earlier chapters, will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And remember Jesus' quote in Matthew 24. Here's what he referred to when Matthew said, understand this. And on the wing of the temple, he'll set up the abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out upon him. So we got the decree to rebuild the temple. That was the 7 sevens. 49. We got the 62 sevens, which add up to 483. Messiah's crucified, destruction of Jerusalem, time out. And we're waiting for the 70th 7, when God's going to call time in. We're somewhere in this time period here. Now, the clock starts again when this peace treaty is made between the Antichrist and Israel. And Daniel talks about, and Jesus talks about in Matthew 24 and Revelation, that the Antichrist will be the leader or the ruler over those 10 nations, which are the 10 toes with iron mixed with clay. Daniel tells us, one of the ways we'll know who he is he'll knock down 3 of the countries of the old Roman Empire and conquer them, and he'll take control over the other 10. That's the person that will make the peace treaty with Israel. And we learn in other passages that the reason Israel does it is the king of the north is moving in to invade them. And the king of the south is coming in a pincer movement. And Israel turns to the west for security and protection. And apparently the west does a pretty good job on the king of the north and the king of the south, because they're no longer seen again in prophecy. And so he said, understand these things. When you and I see Israel making a giant peace treaty with the old Roman Empire area, let the reader understand. And then Jesus says, and when you see the abomination of desolation set up, get out of town. Now, we know that, and we'll talk about this a lot more from Matthew 24 next week, that Daniel just told us that 3.5 years, or 42 months, or 1,260 days, you'll see all those in the Bible. The abomination of desolation comes after a period of 3.5 years of peace treaty. And then all of a sudden, the abomination of desolation is set up. And at that point, all hell breaks loose. For 3.5 years, we've got the 7 seals of Revelation, which are opened. The seals are the destruction that man can do to man. Then the 7 trumpets below, and that's the picture of the destruction Satan can do to man. And then the 7 bowls of God's wrath are poured out, and that's the picture of what God's judgment will do to man. They all happen in here. And at the end of 3.5 years, then the desolation and the floods poured out upon the Antichrist, and he's destroyed. See, this is the last week's framework. And if we don't understand there's another 7 coming, it's hard to hang and understand all of Olivet Discourse and the other passages that talk about what it's going to be like at the end of time. We know a couple things. We know, for example, that right in the middle, Revelation tells us, that right in the middle, after 3.5 years, the Antichrist is indwelt by Satan. Because Satan falls from heaven and indwells this person called the Antichrist. And that's when he sets up that abomination of desolation, because Satan's always wanted to be worshipped. Say, well, we'll know when this starts, when we see the peace treaty. Probably not. You know, Anwar Sadat tried to make one. That didn't work. Carter tried to make it work. He couldn't make it work. Ronald Reagan worked on it. He couldn't do it. Jimmy Carter tried it. He couldn't do it. You see Bush in those pictures recently? He's got the Israeli leaders and the Palestinian leader, peace in our time. No, he won't do it. But they'll sign treaties. All those guys sign treaties. Which one's the right one? We probably won't know. But Jesus said this. Here's the sign. When you see that abomination of desolation set up, now you know. Kind of what we're looking for. During that last year, just a thought here. Oh, by the way, we'll talk a bit next week about who this Antichrist is. Satan always has one ready, the Bible seems to teach us. He doesn't know who he'll be. But Adolf Hitler was ready. He could have used him. Alexander Zhirinovsky, that Russian leader a few years ago. A lot of folks said he's the Antichrist. Vladimir Putin, he's the Antichrist, some say. Osama bin Laden, he's going to be the one, Bill Clinton, he could be it, And can you believe all the Christians? This is so embarrassing. I'm so embarrassed by all these Christians who've identified the Antichrist as Barack Obama, and they're shooting emails all over the internet because he must be the Antichrist. Come on. I'm embarrassed by that. But we can know who he is. Revelation tells us his number is 666. Take the letters of his name and add it up, and you'll get 66. And it's interesting that Hillary Clinton is 666. No, just kidding. She's not 666. Just kidding. Okay. But you can add up the number of his name. Next week we'll add it up. And you can figure out a few names that do add up to 666. A few lessons. Now we've got a framework in place. Is that okay? Got a framework. And for most of us, the focus is on that last 7. It hadn't happened yet. And so we'll pick up next week and discuss, all right, from this point, put some flesh on what these last signs might look like that the disciples asked. A couple of personal lessons. Number 1, discerning Christians have no reason to be afraid, baffled, or confused. God wants us to understand these things. Revelation says a blessing on those who read Revelation and understand it. He wants us to know these things. Number 2, one of the best personal investments you and I can ever make is in global outreach. Glad we have a giant global outreach program at CASAS. It helps bring in the kingdom. The money you and I give, the many of us who go overseas, is helping bring in the gospel.